everybody to this special public event around this exhibition, which we've called Between Presumption and Melancholy. And I'll come to the title in a minute, but yes, this is Rhiân Williams, one of the key voices in the video series, providing the narrative to this video of the Australian flag fluttering. So, Rhiân, welcome.
Thank you, thank you.
As I said, we've been friends since an initial workshop of the Women's Climate Congress in 2020. And it was, you were there in your capacity as a person committed and an expert in conflict resolution, which was kind of the place we were in, right? It was the climate wars, thinking about it in terms of how do we resolve this conflict. And then months later, I invited you to participate in this project, which I've called Body and Breath, to take it out of the politics and say, well, what is the subjective experience of climate change? Let's move from the political to the personal and vulnerable. What does it do to our bodies? What is it doing to our breath? And you gladly participated, and I'm grateful because you have a real presence. You have a real presence. You bring real meaning to the conversation. So thank you. So to start, and this is a two-way conversation. I'm not really, the expert, and neither are you. We're all here, and then we'll have a question Q&A session. What has happened for you since Black Summer, and thinking about your contribution to this at the time and what has passed, what do you think has changed for you since that seminal summer?
Okay, thank you. I guess the first thing I'd like to do actually is to acknowledge the traditional owners.
Thank you.
And acknowledge that we are on country where in fact people have been managing the environment and responding to climate in ways that have kept this environment strong with a sense of integrity that since colonisation we have in many ways dismantled. So, and I also want to acknowledge that in terms of the piece of work, that idea of, you use the term climate wars, that in fact there shouldn't be a war about something that every single person's body is going to experience. And many of the people who are our political leaders will talk about the importance of the future and children and looking at the impacts on on future generations. And those impacts will be felt and lived through in the bodies of all of us and those to come. So I think one of the things that was so powerful about this project was getting people to reflect on what was it like to live through that summer, and we all lived through that summer. And it's extraordinary actually, as I was walking in here today, just thinking, what I remember, because I volunteer with the bushfire brigade where I live, was, the information that goes out to the public is structured in such a way so that it doesn't panic people, but every single worst case scenario was actually being given to the public because the fires were beyond anything that had ever been experienced. And what was the only thing that we were being told was the only thing that will stop these fires is rain. And so, today it's raining.
Yes.
And it's like, I was thinking, oh damn, people probably might not come, so thank you for coming. But also just this thing which is so central. Often we don't think about it. We just think, oh, it's raining, but in fact, to realise the lives of ourselves and so many other people and so much of what we cherish was in the hands of the weather.
Totally.
But the weather, the climate that shapes the weather, it's in our hands. And yeah.
Well, what struck me about what you had to say at the time was reflecting on body and breath, the planet's body and breath, and how the smoke travelled, the circumference of the globe twice from Australia.
Yeah.
So we were thinking, in that way about it.
And what's really interesting is just during the week, I don't know if anyone saw the article in The Guardian, so they're looking at air pollution in Australia, and you can put your postcode in and see what the air pollution is in your area. And the World Health Organization says that if air pollution's over 5, then in fact it's really bad for human health. Air pollution should be under 5. on the particular scale. And so I put in my postcode and it's sitting at 7.5. So we were like, I think during the Black Summer, there were like the air pollution levels were in some instances 1,000 times what, you know, the World Health Organization says is good for people. But even now, 7.5, like it's more than double, like, you know, so it's still a problem now. But we don't see it. The one thing about the Black Summers was that we saw the climate catastrophe that's unfolding. We saw it, we felt it, we experienced it. But and I guess one of the things that's changed for me since then is that sense of, there was a sense of urgency and a sense of a need for collective action and a realization we were all in it together.
Yeah.
But that seems to have dissipated. And you don't want the catastrophe or the cataclysm to be the thing that is the catalyst for the action. And I'm still struggling with how we have action.
So has something changed at the level of the volunteer bushfire brigade of which you're part, at least? Has the conversation changed at that level about the future and what you do in your job?
I think one of the things for brigades is that often there's a period of action when there's fires, but because we've had three years of rain pretty much, that it's kind of slipped from focus. And one of the things that a lot of people may remember is that all of the fire chiefs around Australia at the time were saying we're in a climate emergency, climate change is real, and they were saying that to Conservative governments. But there is sometimes still a dissonance, I think, between what's said at the leadership level within the fire services and how ordinary people, because as we know, climate change and dealing with the climate catastrophe has been so deeply politicised. And I don't know if anyone was reading the news today, if you could get past the stuff about the thing that happened in the UK, that would be a republic, that they were talking about the politicisation of the Bureau of Meteorology and the amount of money that the Bureau of Meteorology has had to spend on defending itself from attacks by the Australian in particular about how spurious their records are in terms of, you know, climate, like the temperature increases.
Yes.
So even though we have a political change, many of the same forces are still at play to try and influence things.
True. Well, of course, we had a mini political earthquake with the last election in terms of out with the old and in with the new, and so-called TEALs, or community-based MPs or members of parliament. Certainly there has been a whole lot of hope generated since the last election. I have to say that part of me did feel relief with that. So coming back to the work itself, for me it was about catharsis. Where do I find catharsis? And actually it was an opportunity to find solidarity in my grief with other women in the capital region. So there were 12 women who I interviewed, and seeking, I guess, in my own new practice as an emerging artist to create what I would call social practice art. Because one, I was challenged, how do I make work, given climate change, I don't want to use new canvas and oils. What's the low carbon footprint work I can do? And digital work seemed to speak to that. Two, it was about not the artist and his or her ego, but, you know, being sort of part of something that was community building. So I did find catharsis through this, and you were a huge part of that. I was really encouraged because you say it like it is, you say it meaningfully, you have real presence, but there is always hope, and we want to come to hope at the end. So I did with the election think, right, I can relax, I can take a deep breath. There are some adults in charge. It's going to be expert-led. You know, it's going to be collaborative. And yet there are speed bumps for sure, and there are special interests for sure. And so it's not like we can rest on our laurels, right? It's ongoing, but that's everything. That's the messiness of everything. It's iterative. Keep up the pressure. Continue to have the conversation. So that's, for me, what I think has changed. But I haven't stopped grieving, and key in this is grappling with my own personal grief as a cancer patient, what do I do with that? What do I do with brokenness in all its manifestation? I see it increasingly as the flip of love. Without love, you can't have grief. So that's what I've really come to in the last, 4 months since the diagnosis. And then there's climate, and then there's all those other converging and the confluence of issues in our world. So yeah, that's what's changed fundamentally for me since we last saw each other 3 years ago.
I was going to ask, one of the things that was a really powerful part of this project was the performance that you did, which I remember was live streamed during COVID. So we saw that during lockdown, and it was an extraordinary experience to see that at a point in time when we had no idea what was happening in the world. And there was something about that performance that captured that agony of disconnection and that grief that what we'd been through, which was then continuing into something else that was new. And it was that sense of what else can happen. But I was really interested to hear from you what that performance meant for you.
It was certainly a moment of absolute vulnerability. I look back and think, what was I thinking? Because honestly, it was wanting to showcase, to show off the disparate but integrated parts of my honours work, which were the interviews, which included photographs, paintings, and then of course there was the grief of the pandemic. And I was at art school, but wasn't at art school because the ANU was closed, so you couldn't access the workshops. And that's kind of why the digital work came out of that time, because really I had planned sculpture and all sorts of things. So it was a case of improvisation and what's planned. You really had, didn't we? We all had to work creatively in those years and work with what we had. And the school kept saying, don't quit, persevere. And there were lots of students, especially 19 and 20-year-olds, who were thinking, no, I can't do this honours year. And I kept saying, actually, but this is life, and this is the life of you know, expect a whole lot of these things. And flexibility is what will help you be the artist you need to be going forward, because hybridity is the thing. So we did persevere, I persevered. The performance itself, look, there was a lot of affirmation. This was a live performance because of because of COVID. It was online, and I was expressing through my body grief, but then there was excerpts of spoken word, music, and imagery that I'd made, and lots of affirmation and people saying thank you. You know, as artists, we don't talk enough. As activists, we don't talk enough about what has led us there, and we don't have a lot of space to actually mourn together. We're kind of in protest mode, and we're angry a lot of the time. We're frustrated, but we don't explore the emotions around that, and they were grateful for the space for that. But then there was also the odd critic, and you know how we are just wired algorithmically to remember what people said isn't good versus what is great. And so there were a couple of really sharp, short emails about, you know, I'm a performance artist, so that wasn't performance art, you know, and I'm a dancer and you don't know what dance is. And so I was like, and so I had to really process that as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? One of the person who's speaking in that video, Sarah talks about the imagery that came to mind for her was about childbirth, not so in relation to the performance, but in relation to the space of grief. And it is that sense. And one of the things that I was struck by with that performance is that in fact it was birthing a new narrative. And one of the roles, I guess, of artists is to provoke people to see things differently. And I guess it's that, you know, and that includes even when people are being critical of what you're doing, they're still engaged with it.
Sure.
Yes. And in the spirit of transparency, may I say that my first children's picture book came out in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, launched on the 1st of April. And
not good for sales.
Not good for book launches. But one of the people who reviewed it said, it's a very good book, but there's a lot of repetition. It's a children's book written in rhyme, teaching kids how to count. So there will always be critics. So.
Sure.
And I think what's the quote from Brene Brown? All praise and glory goes to the person who's in the arena, because the person in the arena is the person who's carrying the fight and the courage to bring attention to what needs to be seen.
Thank you. So, by way of a sort of third and final question before we open it up, you know, as I say, this has been about lamentation or lament, and in that performance I wore hessian, referencing, you know, Jewish tradition of lamentation, beating my breast somewhat, and rubbing charcoal on my face, and using the sort of symbols of fire as well as of renovation or restoration. Yes, you can't have resurrection without chaos and destruction. You cannot do that. And post Easter, you know, we're reflecting again on the cancer story and what the hell is this about, and you can't have renewal without death of some kind or another, even if it's the death of cells you wish to be destroyed. So I think there's a lot there, and I'd like to think that there's work I will make about cancer, to name it and acknowledge it, and you know, how we are ultimately storytellers in our own way, and that every opportunity is a reason to share experience and find connection with others. And so I have another thing. Although I'll say, first year uni at the ANU School of Visual Art and Design, we had this project to graffiti an aspect of the school, of the grounds of the campus, foundation class project, and I transformed, it's a positive way of putting it, a sign for parking for people with a disability, and you know, refugees welcome or something, rather than disability parking welcome or something. I can't remember the exact words, but I, you know, did it in blue tape as described in the existing aluminium sign and so on, and it upset a few people because it was only supposed to be up for an hour or two while being assessed, but it was there all afternoon, and the person with the disability came and her parking spot had been, you know, manipulated, and it was outrageous. And she went to the head of school, the dean of school, wrote to the CC, the vice chancellor, and so on. And I'm sitting weeks later in the office of the head of the art school, and the foundation teacher was just really annoyed. This was taking time away from teaching and the stuff he had to do, and he was not generous with me, but he said, "At least you've got a story now." And I said, "No, actually, I don't need another story." But it's like that, you know, cancer's another story, and I'm primed for people's stories about cancer in a way I wasn't before, and stories of success particularly, so please share those. And that takes us a little bit to the role of the arts, you know, and I've been thinking a bit about this, the point of it all, and the point of life, existential questions more broadly. And you come at it as an artist as well, as a singer, in a choir.
Well, in a shanty crew, not quite a choir.
What is that for the unschooled?
So sea shanties had probably everyone's heard of them now because they had a moment during COVID. One of the things that was really great, the folk festival came back last year, and I wrote a protest song ahead of the election, which was based on a shanty, which is, I'll just quickly do a little bit. Oh my God, it's going to be video. Damn you, Scott, we're burning in Australia. Way, hey, burning in Australia. Damn you, Scott, we're burning in Australia while you deny climate change. And it's based on Help Me Bob, I'm Bully in the Alley. And so one of the things that I think was really powerful about that was leading a song for the first time at the folk festival. I'd never done that before, but also a protest song that I borrowed the melody, but I'd written the words. And just in that moment, that I think the thing about being an artist and the difference between being an artist and an activist, I often feel in my activism work that I'm quite grumpy. And I'm trying to make people see what needs to be done. But I think that the thing about it is, but I also know, you know, that old expression, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. You get people on your side with joy. And you get people able to see a way, like, you know, the Harvard Negotiating School, build a golden bridge for your enemy to cross over. I've spent 37 years of my life, 36 years of my life working in dispute resolution. And it is that thing of, you never get anywhere by actually being adversarial. You need to find what it is that connects you to the other person, which was what was so powerful about this project, that we were all in that moment together. And then you need to find how to bring the people to your side to work together on the problem. And song is a great way of doing that, and art is a great way of doing that. And sometimes art, even by provoking those conversations, I recently went to an exhibition at the Belconnen Arts Centre where there was an installation which was sticks with pieces of paper glued to them, and it was hung, and the shadows were amazing. And for some reason, it swept me away. It was just austere, and it was resonant to me of the idea of, this is what is ahead of us if we don't act, if we don't realize the emergency that we're in, that what will be left are just remnants of what is an extraordinary creation or an extraordinary world, wherever you land on that continuum. And I think the importance of art is to make the conversation happen, and also to find ways of creating joy that people can see that it matters to do this and we can do it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I don't know how many of you might have seen the recent documentary about Bob Brown. If it's still showing, I would really encourage people to go and see it. And one of the things that he talks about is the importance of optimism. There is no doubt that we're in extreme circumstances, but it's also really important. We can either just give up now and just go, well, let's just, buy 17 houses, negatively gear them, and just, hope that our wealth will protect us. Or we can realize that, in fact, all of late stage capitalism, none of it is going to protect us. What's going to protect us is actually realizing this environment, this is our foundation, and our connection with each other, this is the thing, and our connection with the natural world, this is the thing that will
Well, a lot is said these days about resilience, resilient communities, resilient people. I'm not sure I understand what is meant, it's contextual, but community building, I think, is the heart of it going forward, and art can play a role. I think increasingly I see the visual arts as contemplative action, so it's an opportunity for me to find a kind of therapy, what is it that I'm feeling, what is it that I need to express, get out there, but at the same time, what is it that's out there that needs to challenge me? And so it's that two-way conversation you have with yourself and the world. In some ways, art is in service of something personal and something bigger. Now, you could call that sacred work. I'd like to think it's sacred work, and I've been thinking a while, and there are a few in the audience who are doctors of theology, that art is a lot like theology in three ways, at least three ways. Now, theology being about something outside of ourselves that's bigger than us, much bigger than us, and is somewhat of a mystery. What are those three ways? Well, the first is it's about praise. Art and theology do praise. They find what is beautiful and they praise it. They hold on to the sweet nuggets of the everyday. They find and articulate, what we can delight in, like poetry, like song. Art and sacred work is similar in that it's about communication. It's communicative, and so there are those stories. And there's language, so in your case, the language of children's books, the language of repetition, the language of playfulness. And the arts obviously has its own languages, from mixed media, digital art, painting. And finally, theology and art are also critical, so they critique culture. They are meant to be subversive in nature, as well as do the the lighting and the praising and so on. So they ask big questions and encourage us to go deeper. So, you know, not all art does that, of course, and it's captive to deep capitalism too, and isn't always the generative work we'd hope it would be, but I think it asks big questions of us. What are our regular habits? What are our rights and responsibilities? What pokes questions at what are the systems that hold societies together and their worth, from economic to political. They ask existential questions. So that's what I've come to see increasingly, and I just don't know where, by the grace, my life will go, but I'd really like to hope that there's more opportunity for creativity, and in doing that, sacred work. So to finish up before opening it up, do you feel hopeful? Where are you finding hope at the moment?
That's a really challenging question. I think hope is something I aspire to. One of the things that I think probably one of the things that's become a greater focus for me is looking at inequality. So I think so there's an amazing book written by Richard Wilkinson, which is, he's an epidemiologist who's looked at OECD data and found that the greater the inequality within a society, the greater the levels of anxiety and depression within that society across all levels. So even if you're very affluent in a very unequal society, you're highly likely to experience anxiety and depression. But also, the more unequal a society is, the less likely it is that society will effectively be able to address problems like climate change, species extinction, violence against women. Inequality is probably the single biggest thing that I think we need to be focusing on. And, you know, against the backdrop of a budget being delivered in this town next week that I'm not optimistic about, will address significant structural causes of inequality. But what does give me, I guess, a sense of optimism and hope is that, so two things. One is, I'm a vegan. Any other vegans in the room? No.
Vegetarians.
Vegetarians, yeah, cool. I'm not one of those vegans that say, oh, you only have to be vegan. But the thing that gives me optimism is that there are more and more people who are looking at plant-based. And, you know, the main driver of species extinction in Australia is land clearing. The main reason for land clearing in Australia is clearing land for beef and cattle, or cattle and meat production. So one of the easiest things we can do is actually look at what's on our dinner and breakfast and lunch plates. It's a simple way we can every day take steps to mitigate impacts of climate. So that gives me optimism and hope that people are much more aware of this, and you know, you go to the supermarket now. And the other thing that gives me optimism is during lockdown, it was extraordinary to see, you know, animals turning up in places that are like, oh, the two legs are at home, and they reclaimed the space. And like, you know, last year there was the reports that bogong moth's population had massively collapsed, but the bogong moth population has resurged. Last year we had so much rain, there were so many frogs. Like, it was like, they were very, very noisy, and they were everywhere, and it was wonderful.
Yes.
So what does give me optimism is we are limited, finite, fragile beings, which is why we need to savor every moment of joy that we have. And we don't live as a system as such, we live as an individual, but we're part of a system, and the resilience and the strength in that system is extraordinary. And what gives me hope is that when we got out of the way during the lockdowns, in fact, and because people weren't flying, you know, there's a massive reduction in emissions from flights. This system is so strong. If we can see that and bring the support to it, I actually do have optimism that it will rebound, that it will be resilient.
Thank you, Rhiann. So for me, it is about our young people, and our son, middle of 3 kids, is a recent vegetarian, wants to be a vegan, but
He'll get there.
even though his mentor keeps saying, no, only when you're 27, that your brain is really very elastic and needs it as a young man, needs meat. So he's decided, no, to take a more ethical position. But they're just a very kind and compassionate lot. They're a much more inclusive generation, and that gives me hope. I think our politics does give me hope. We know that politics is never perfect, it's always full of negotiation and compromise, but there are some really good things, and I think obviously the referendum is absolutely the kind of moment where grief meets lamentation and grief meets hope, because we've got a Prime Minister who's prepared to be vulnerable, to cry at the podium. So those are some of the things. And of course, you know, thinking about the sacred, medicine is an intervention when used well, you know, and so I'm personally encouraged by the possibilities of that. So there's plenty of hope, but but it's fragile, and it moves up and down, and it kind of needs grief to keep the love on, if you know what I mean. So it's never one or the other. I think grief and hope work together. So, Rhiân, thank you. That was wonderful as always.
Thank you.
And I would like to open it up now if there are any questions of us or of each other, really, because you all have really deep experiences, your own professional lives, as daughters, mothers, fathers, sons. And yeah, if you've seen the work, any reflection on that, so please feel able to ask it. Have you seen the work in the room or not? Yeah?
I might make a comment about the work, about this one, just to see if everyone else has had the same experience as me. When it comes to these parts of it, it's just coming up now, actually, the breathing, I felt absolutely compelled to breathe along with it. Did anyone else have that?
Yeah. So this is Tess Horwitz, who is a Canberra artist who died quite suddenly in January. So it has extra poignancy. And she is a brilliant breather. She just breathed into the mic. So before the interviews, I'd say, come with your breath and breathe into the mic. And she did it so well, as did you. There were other quiet breathers. So Sarah, you don't hear a thing. She's breathing quietly. And she's reflecting, Tess Horwitz is reflecting on the wildness of climate change, or the wildness of these climate events, and in those moments actually being blown away by the beauty of things as much as I guess the ugly or destructive nature of things. So she described the hailstorm as nature, you know, you want to run and find shelter, but actually you also just want to stare at the thing. and the hail as it came down and brought down branches. So she just has this way of saying, even in the midst of the chaos, there is something that strikes us as one powerful to, you know, nature speaking, and nature's wildness being beautiful in some ways. And Tess, you know, as a mentor of mine who I really miss, sees art in every day and the everyday in art. So she just had a way of making it, inspired that piece. And then Sarah here, Sarah Bachelard, who leads as a minister in the Anglican Church, St Benedictus in Lynham in the ACT, reflects very much on, as you say, what's possible, a new birth. She says, call me crazy, some call me foolish, but I have hope that this will really shape the tree enough for all the systems, you know, for all the systems to be illuminated in a way that says something's got to give and a new birth is possible. And she has this way with words as well, and she talks about how that summer there was a change of liturgy. You know, it wasn't a season of rest and relaxation, of play in the sun. It was the season that said, actually, this is different, and expect more of the same, if not further disruption. So yeah, she mentions that at the start, and the playing being, I guess, evocative of systems, but pieces of nature either side to reflect on. And the point is that we meditate here. As you say, in building bridges, you don't want to hit people over the head with the climate change is real, get with the program, panic, and do something. It's actually an invitation to reflect. Isn't it? Thank you.
Can I say, I'm curious what what people's own experience was of grief over that summer, and how you've travelled with that since that time.
Well, Vanessa in the front row helped lead the response to the pandemic in the ACT, and so was at the front line of a public health issue, but conscious too of the environmental stuff about this is one among many, you know, climactic kind of related things.
No, we were very involved in the bushfires as well. So yeah, every day I'd speak to the head of the education directorate to determine whether the kids could go out and play. You know, we were distributing masks all around to the pharmacies, and all of the messaging. It was funny. Like I'm still processing that grief, because I remember once we stood down the health emergency centre for the fires, and we were in Melbourne, and I could just see this thing with COVID evolving, and I rang the chief health officer and said, we need to stand this thing up again. And she cried and she said, I just need a day between these things. And then we stood up the longest health emergency in history, health emergency control centre in history of ACT. So I'm still processing. But I do recall when it had rained and the fires had cleared and we were just on the up with COVID. I remember driving down the parkway and thinking at the time, you know, this is really bad. This is going to be bad. But at least I can't see. Like, at least there's clear air.
Yeah.
And yet, but then both were linked to breath, right?
Yeah.
In one instance, we were breathing in smoke, in another it was a viral vector.
Yes.
And our breath was potentially risking others. So, yeah, I can't say much more. I'm still processing.
Ongoing, isn't it?
Yeah, and the other thing that also strikes me about that is just, I remember at that time, everyone wanted masks. And you couldn't get one. And there was no division about masks. But it was that thing of, we can see this, therefore, because we can see it, it's real. And I'm struck anew every time it happens. People, we're fundamentally empiricists. If we can't see it, it doesn't exist.
Exactly. And we're all captive to it, even though I know the science, you know.
Yeah. And so, and that was an extraordinary change. And so the thing that I think at the moment too, in terms of grief, is a thing you feel, and in that moment we had a shared grief. We were going through something together, and so I think the power of projects like this is the reminder of that thing that we have shared and that we continue to share. Which is
Absolutely. Well, I think it doesn't just go. You sit with it and you hold it and you look at it, and it shows itself in different ways, different dimensions. As I say, Sarah describes the possibilities of epiphany when you sit with it long enough as well. So it's positive.
I wonder if there are other people who have other reflections on how they've travelled with the grief since that time. So I'm going to laugh because I feel like often I run groups and I teach people, and it's like, if you make eye contact with me, I'm like, what would you like to say? But I'm not allowed to do that here. So.
Well, here's a question perhaps to provoke it. I mean, have we had any national ceremony to mark Black Summer and its impacts? The loss then, the present loss and the future loss. We haven't. And that is my serious beef, which is that the tragedy of this is not acknowledging the tragedy of this. And the pandemic's the same. Like, you know, what Prime Minister has actually said, let's take a moment to remember those who couldn't get to that funeral.
I think we might have been acknowledging the Black Summer. We might have even been memorialising it, had it not been for
The pandemic.
what happened straight after.
True, but we've had time to catch up, and I just feel like there hasn't been any intentional space created by national leaders that has said, actually, I know you've been through a lot, and I want to register that. I want to feel it with you. I want to sit in the mud a little bit. You know, let's get on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And to see it as actually the way in which we will find the energy for the next thing.
Yeah.
Because it's not about dwelling in it. It's actually with a view to this is going to be restorative. Look into each other's eyes, register that you've been through stuff. I mean, the Victorian government was pretty good at that, I thought, in celebrating we're all in this together, better than the other states. And yet there probably still wasn't a moment to say, but we know this was really hard and we're going to take time with some ceremony. And that's where I think, you know, religion and spirituality in all its forms does have a role to play going forward in the face of climate.
And art, I think.
And art.
Yeah, and in fact I think that there are still projects going on, for example, down the south coast, where they're saying that in fact only now people are starting to talk about the trauma of 3 years ago, because it was so overwhelming and then it was followed so hot on the heels by COVID, and as you say, that there wasn't that time to process it. And so it's a bit like people just do put their head down and keep moving, because you know, but actually there's only so much that bodies can bear and carry, and they do need to stop and honour and acknowledge whatever that is. And there would still be people, for example, who lost their houses that haven't been rebuilt. Or
how will that show itself if they haven't dealt with that grief that's underlying, is my real concern. And especially about our young people, for whom there are layers of grief about never owning a home, about losing a friend or whatever, to, you know, the loss of autonomy in terms of addiction, technology, vaping, whatever. There's a whole lot of grief. And where are the spaces for them, not beyond the therapy of one-to-one with a psychiatrist, where it's community that says, we've got you. That for me is the question. And I you know, as I say, time, willing and grace, I really like to see what's possible, because that's the grief work I think we need to do.
I might, if I can, just to think about your question of, well, how was it for you and what's changed or what's happened since. I mean, the Black Summer was a trigger point for me, I suppose.
Yes.
Built on many previous years of frustration around, you know, obviously worsening situation and adversarial public discourse that I always could see wasn't going to provide the environment where the solutions could emerge. And then the bushfires came, and you know, and it was just so awful. And we were all in this terrible Holocaust sort of thing of the fires, and looking at the young children and wondering, you know, what this meant for them and their future, you know. And out of that, I started a new women's organisation, thinking to bring that voice of grief and women's leadership into the public discourse, to try and create a way forward that was not adversarial, that we could sort of find a public conversation that would bring people together and create sort of a national plan of action that we could all get behind.
Yes.
And I mean, I didn't really think it through at the time, because you don't.
Well, thank God, because nothing would happen if we thought it through.
About what that was going to mean for my life, you know,
Yes,
going forward. You know, the whole formation of an organisation and all of that goes with that. And then, of course, COVID came along, and something that probably would have kept on having live meetings in Canberra, maybe inviting people from other places to come. Suddenly we could go online, and suddenly we could talk to people all over the country, and that was marvellous. But it also broadened out the conversation to a whole range of new ideas that have made that original nugget of an idea just about a non-adversarial conversation broaden out into a whole justifiably complex thing about social equity and other aspects of what we really need to do to change our society in order to have even if we solve this problem now, to have an ongoing sustainable future. And that's been absolutely enormous. And I was saying to Rhiann as we came in earlier this year, I'm sort of hitting a bit of little bit of a wall in some ways as to where this is all going and how to.
Yes.
And in fact, maybe I'll toss a question back to you. When you were talking earlier, it really reminded me that recently, among the many things that you do in an organisation to bring all the threads together and weave something going forward, we've been talking about a theory of change. What's our theory of change?
Yes.
And it seemed to me that embedded in what you were saying, especially when you talked about the Golden Bridge, there was a theory of change ideas embedded there, but not being expressed exactly in those terms. And of course, the role of the arts too is.
Yes.
And I just wondered whether you might like to say something about what do you think? What would be your theory? Even if you don't express it in quite those terms, what is, what's the change here that we need,
Wow. Well, I see it kind of spoken to in Treasury terms.
Yeah.
You've seen a move towards not a budget,
Yeah,
but a well-being budget.
yeah,
So this idea that actually there's no one thing, but the objective is the well-being of all our citizens.
yeah,
And that's a huge shift if they're
Yeah.
able to not listen to the special interests in the room and actually appreciate what well-being
Yeah.
is. Now that's what the Treasurer's embarked on. Meanwhile, he's been sidetracked by other things.
yeah,
But it's a sense of each of these things are connected,
yeah,
and that so change needs to touch the sides of everything,
yeah.
and that if and that all boats must rise with the tide. Otherwise, why are we doing it?
Yeah.
Be the question, I think, going forward. So it's that stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. At the beginning of so I'm self-employed. I've been self-employed for more years than I can care to remember. I do a whole range of different things, including dispute resolution. I work with economists to produce cost-benefit analyses. But at the beginning of COVID, my practice completely collapsed. And one of the things that I was contacted by the one remaining client I had, who was very, very precious, who said, what can you do to help us get through COVID? They were an organisation of about 20 people. And because I'd worked for myself for a really long time, they actually said, can you facilitate Zoom get-togethers of us? And I'm like, no. Knowing how bad I was at technology, there was no way I could do that. But also, having worked for myself for a long time, what I knew that people would miss were those tangential conversations you have when you meet someone in the coffee room and it's like, how was your weekend? Oh, I saw you just got, your eldest child just got married, or all those things that are about relationship and connection. And so what I said to them was, actually what I think would be really useful is if I put a call into every single one of your staff members at least once a week to say, hi, how are you? There's no particular task focus to that conversation. It's about checking in, how are you doing? And then flash forward a couple of years. So I did that and I worked with their staff. They now have 30 staff. I had a new client who wanted to referee me for a piece of work. And I asked the CEO of the organisation if they would speak to this person. And they said, yeah, happy to do that. And when they spoke to them, they said, this is one thing I'm going to tell you. Over the last 3 years that we've been working with Rhiann, she has saved us $200,000 each year. Because in terms of the comparison for the amount of that our workers' compensation insurance compared to similar organisations, our premium is $200,000 a year less.
Wow.
That is what she's delivering for us. And along with other things as well. But the critical thing for me that I think drives me crazy in all of this stuff is when we have things that the distributional analysis would say, all the benefits go to a certain group, the disadvantage, the impacts are felt by all of us. So if I pollute a river and I make a lot of money doing that, the people downstream pay the price of remediating that river. But one individual has made themselves an immense amount of wealth at the expense of the rest of us. So the critical thing for me thinking about that theory of change is getting people to realise exactly as you were saying, the economics of doing it. We should do this because it's the right thing, right? We should do this because there is no planet B. We should do this because it matters, right? But the critical thing, having spent my life trying to advocate for change, is the single biggest thing that actually makes the difference is getting people to realise actually economically it makes sense to do this. It's widely acknowledged we have a productivity problem in Australia. Unequal societies are less productive. If you want to be a more productive Australia, you need to be a more equal Australia. And so, having just written to the new Treasurer several times about inequality, it's a distortion when the amount of benefit that's going to the richest 20% is 3,338 times what is going to the poorest 20%.
Sure.
And if you don't care, right, if you don't care because you're doing really well in the system, my message is actually you should care, because in fact that inequality is impacting on your kids' mental health. It's impacting on the one planet we all share. So the thing that I guess is really important is realizing we are in this together, and doing this together makes sense and actually is economically as well as environmentally and socially sensible.
Great way to finish, I think. Unless there's a burning question out there. I mean, the other thing I would say quickly, and we can chat about this obviously at length, is often we don't work on the runway to the plane taking off, as it were, the idea or the policy. So, do you know what I mean? So the conversations, the laying the groundwork for the process work of the public service engaging the public with a campaign. So on tax, why do we keep taking off and then it just flops? Because of the runway work hasn't been done. And being hijacked by the Australian, and the conversation about conflict and who are the losers rather than who will win, and what equality would look like. So, just that piece. I understand the change you want to see, but what's the runway piece? And so that it doesn't flop over, or there's a change of government and we lose it. Whether it's gender responsive budgeting that Labor wants now, but a coalition government wins and then turfs. So it's the double thing.
Just really quickly, in my most recent desperate plea to the Treasurer, it was like the Welsh Future Generations Commissioner has just been visiting Australia. You might have heard her on Radio National. And one of the things that I actually said was, perhaps you could ask Treasury officials to say, how does this policy that's being advanced to the Treasurer
impact future generations?
But also, how does it mitigate against inequality? And if it doesn't mitigate against inequality, then don't do it. Like, how is this policy making us more equal? And that's, and that includes the future generations as well. But anything we do about making things more equal now will be a benefit to future generations.
Rhiân Williams, lovely to have you today, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm really delighted. We've got a full house. How about that on a day like today? So that says a lot.
And thank you, Toni, for initiating this extraordinary project, for having the courage and the conviction to bring it and to follow it 3 years later. So thank you.
Thank you.